emotional intelligence. Have you ever heard that term? Well, it's a term that was it's been around for a while. I think back in the maybe the 70s ish or some it first appeared somewhere in a couple of articles and then it came. But a guy named Daniel Goleman popularized it in the 90s. And he was specifically looking at the field of high performance in corporate leadership and other kinds of high performing leaders. And his kind of byline, I'm paraphrasing here, but we talk about IQ and IQ being so important, and which it is. It is basically somebody's IQ is the best predictor of long-term success, over life in kind of the performance arenas. Doesn't mean you have to be a genius, but it kind of like smart people do smart things, and the rest of us just pedal hard, right? But IQ is important. If you're going to be a you know a trade, if you have to learn a trade, you got to your intelligence to understand the skills involved. If you're going to learn a profession like accounting or law or medicine, we have to our intelligence is important. We have to learn all those principles. But here's what Goldman kind of highlighted back then, and everybody's seen this, you've experienced it in your own work, that if you take this bar right here, okay, and this is like all of those measures like IQ, test scores, education, the degrees people have, the experience they have, you get to a point, like if you go to the C-suite, for example, or upper levels in a company, pretty much everybody around that table looks the same on those measures. They all have roughly within, certainly less than a standard deviation, but roughly the same range of intelligence, roughly the same educational background, different schools, but same educational background, roughly the same kind of career path, roughly, they all kind of like are qualified is basically what we're saying here. But above all those qualifications, you've got some that perform way, 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 way better than others on a number of measures. So it's not intelligence only, it's not experience, it's not education. There's this other set of factors that has a lot to do with how well we do in life, specifically in corporate or business life, but also in our personal lives. And I would say that's, obviously just as important. So if it's not IQ and brains and experience and education and all that, well, what is it? Well, Goldman called it emotional intelligence. And there's been a lot of people that have written about that and talked about it ever since. But what is it? Well, there's a lot of different ways to look at this. But kind of the buckets you see it fall in is, and this is what I want us to look at ourselves, as we talk about this. Think about yourself. The first one is what's broadly referred to as emotional awareness. Emotional awareness. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's pretty much how aware we are of ourselves. It's kind of self awareness is a broader way to look at it than just emotional. But knowing our strengths, our weaknesses, our feelings, being able to name them, being able to know what we're feeling and isolate it and understand it inside of ourselves. I remember I was in a board meeting one time with very, very strong leaders, president of one of the television networks, and he was entering into a topic, and it's a pretty wasn't combative, but it was a highly engaged discussion among the board members. A lot of disagreement, but good disagreement. But he's talking. I'll never forget this. This is a guy that's run huge, huge, huge things. He stopped mid sentence and he said, "Wait, hold on, guys. Am I uh, am I pushing my opinion too much here? I don't want to. I don't want to dominate or anything or talk too much, but I have a tendency to do that. So just tell me if I am. Stop mid sentence, took awareness of himself, and said, "Hold on, I have a tendency to do this. Am I doing it now? Let me know." Because he didn't want to have a bad result in the meeting. Well, that's a great example of self awareness. Also, to know our triggers, because sometimes if we get triggered, whatever's going to come out of our mouth or the pattern behavior that's next is going to be probably not as helpful to us or anybody else as it could be because it's coming out of a trigger. So, a trigger, by definition, it has nothing to do with the situation we're in. It's a trigger from something old, and maybe the situation we're in is similar or it reminds us, but definitely, probably for 99% of the time, the situation we're in, we have many more options of how to respond than the original trigger that might have built that trigger, like abuse in a family of origin or early on in life, or abandonment or criticism or a bunch of other stuff. See, when our triggers are being formed, we don't have the capacity to choose necessarily how we're going to respond to that elevated emotional state. When somebody's abused, they're pretty much frozen, they're paralyzed, and lots of stuff goes on in the brain to kind of freeze that in the brain. That's why we call it, post traumatic stress later. So people with high emotional intelligence have an awareness. I know there's a few things that really get me amped up. And if somebody's going to do those, I recognize it and I got to kind of sit back for a second and go, okay, count to 10. Whatever you say is not going to be good until we get to 11 here because that's, whatever. Okay. So to know what you're feeling. To know what you're feeling is really important also because it gives you indicators as to what's going on. I remember, we learned this. One of the most important things we learn is a group facilitator. When you're doing group therapy, is to be in touch with your own experience. And I remember when I first learned that, my mentor was teaching me just tune into what you're feeling. And I remember I learned to use that, and what led to incredible stuff in groups. For example, somebody may be talking, we may be a half hour into a group therapy, and I might interrupt him and say, "Does it feel empty in here to you guys? Anybody bored? I feel bored." And then people start to go, "Yeah, it does feel like kind of empty here." I mean, it doesn't feel like, we're. And I say, well, sometimes it's empty because we're not talking about what's really should be being talked about, what's present. What do you find yourself, what are some of you thinking as we're going through this emptiness? And then somebody said, well, I just keep thinking about Sharon. And somebody said, well, I do too. And somebody said, well, now that you say it, I do too. And was somebody gotten really upset and left the group, the meeting before. And there was unfinished business there. But see, it it comes from taking that moment to be in touch with your own feelings to know where the other person is. When you're not feeling connected, or you're feeling afraid, or you're feeling angry, or you're feeling sad, sometimes that's a clue into insight to be able to know the situation better. Okay. That's the first one, self awareness. The other aspect is, or another aspect, there's several leads, but another aspect is other awareness. You ever known anybody, they just have no clue how other people are feeling? Just clueless. And not only clueless about how they're feeling, they are clueless about how they are affecting other people to generate some of those feelings. You ever been talking to somebody and you're talking and you just kind of get the sense they're not really with me, they're not listening. Well, that's emotional intelligence. That you have the capacity to be aware of the situation. that somebody's not with you, they're not following you, they're not agreeing. I remember I've seen this 1,000 times, but one meeting in particular, a CEO was addressing his, his team and the people most important in the, sort of chain of this project that were working on it, and they were really not in a good place. And he goes in as Mr. Rah Rah and all this kind of stuff, and walks out and says, "Ah, wasn't that great?" And I said, "No, it's like the worst thing I've ever. You were so out of touch with where they were." He goes, "What are you talking about?" I said, "You were. You didn't. Everything they tried to tell you, you invalid." He goes, "No, I didn't." I said, "Shut up. You're doing it to me." He wasn't really aware of how he was affecting other people. And then another component of emotional intelligence would be actually the ability to self-regulate our emotions. Like, what do you do when we get triggered? Well, a lot of people, trigger means trigger, pull the trigger, right? The emotional brain gets button gets pushed and it's boom. They're immediately out, immediately annoyed, immediately pushing back, immediately angry, immediately sad, immediately over identifying with the victim. Immediately, what they've done is they've lost the range of options of how to respond. And so when we are immediately kind of trigger happy, we don't have emotional regulation. It would be like, you know, what would it be like? It'd be like if remember the I've seen this in the movies, how our defense system, DEFCON 1, DEFCON 2, DEFCON 3, DEFCON 4, and we get to higher levels of alert. When we get to higher levels of alert, now it's when the silos are opening with the nukes pointing everywhere. Well, some people go from 0 to 5 immediately, and they immediately react and shut people down and angry and defensive and all that. Well, another part of emotional intelligence is your ability to regulate. So what have we said? Awareness of yourself, what you're feeling, what your triggers are, what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are. Awareness of others, including the effect that we're having on others. And then thirdly, the ability to regulate and be in charge of a range of options. So when your kid acts out, if it triggers you, an emotionally intelligent person would go, "Oh, I'm having that feeling again. I know not to talk when I'm having this feeling. Hey, Joey, I'm gonna grab a glass of water. I'll be back to you in a second." And maybe have a timeout and talk with yourself. Now we're into emotional regulation. So you're learning, I'm in charge here. I don't have to yell every time something happens I don't like. Wow, there's an insight. Really? I don't? For some people that's like a new awareness that I don't have to scream every time I encounter something I don't like. I didn't know that. Well, you could do a bunch of other stuff. A soft answer turns away wrath sometimes. So it's keeping your options. But to do that, we got to be aware. You can't just be on autopilot.